This subject possesses little interest now. I need not enlarge upon it. Such was the cutting conclusion that the 19th century Scottish medical doctor Francis Adams gave to his commentary on a chapter about depilatories in a medical compendium of Paul of Aegina, who was active in the 7th century CE. What had shocked Smith was the fact that Paul of Aegina had specified that his depilatories were to be used by young men, and in particular for the sexual organs, which Smith called their obscene parts. Smith did not leave the topic, however, before giving at least one juicy passage from Persius' fourth satire. A slightly longer quotation from that satire reads as follows: "How disgusting! Weeding your prick and the recesses of your backside, and exposing your withered nuts to the public. And another thing, while you comb and perfume the rug on your jaws, why does your windpipe stick out clean-shaven from your groin?" Beyond specifying their gender and hinting at their young age, Paul said little about those men who would have used pubic depilatories. There is no condemnation of the type found in ancient satire or moral writing, simply an acknowledgement that the practice existed and that some people depilated, and that they did so partly to appear younger than they actually were. Paul's recipes for pubic depilatories are part of the rather neglected corpus of ancient recipes for what I will call intimate cosmetic products, that is, cosmetics for the sexual organs and for the breasts. The majority of those recipes are preserved in Byzantine medical treatises, as well as a few treatises that are difficult to date, although many of these recipes are dated to a much earlier period. Byzantine cosmetic recipes more generally have recently been examined by Serena Budsey and Irene Kalla, who have focused quite naturally on the more numerous cosmetic recipes for the hair and face. Alessia Guardasole, for her part, has examined some links between recipes found in Byzantine treatises and the table of contents of Crichton's Cosmetics, which is preserved in Galen and on which I will say a little more in a minute. In this paper, I examine cosmetic recipes for intimate care preserved in the works of Pseudo-Galen, Oribasius, Aetius of Amida, and Paul of Aegina, as well as the medical collection preserved under the name of Metrodora. Some of you might be familiar with these texts, might notice the absence of the other very well-known encyclopedist of late antiquity, which is Alexander of Tralles. Alexander of Tralles does give some cosmetic recipes, but they're not for intimate care. I will study the symbolism of some of the ingredients used in those treatments, and I also explore the cultural expectations of beauty that are implicit in the recipes. And finally, I will ask questions about the status of the people using those remedies. Before I turn more fully to the recipes found in the Byzantine authors, it is important to introduce the ancient genre of the medical cosmetic treatise, the Cosmetica. No such treatise is preserved in full, unfortunately, but Galen gave extensive information about and extracts from the treatise on cosmetics of Crito, who was a 1st century author. In particular, he preserved its table of contents, which is extremely informative about what the genre encompassed. Crito's Cosmetics quite naturally listed recipes for the hair, for the face, for the teeth and breath, but it also included less expected items, and in particular, items for intimate care. Here, the contents of Book 2 are particularly interesting. Book 2 included unguents for the breasts, for stretch marks following childbirth, virginity preservers for both boys and girls, and remedies for women who are excessively wet or cold. Book 4, for its part, included, among other things, recipes for afflictions of the penis and various prolapses. Thus, Crichton's cosmetics included recipes that would not have been out of place in ancient gynecological treatises, in sexual manuals, which existed in antiquity, but about which we have very little information. And if they had existed, and to my knowledge they did not, andrological treatises, so treatises looking after the health of men, qua men. This overlap between gynecology, cosmetics, and sexology is something we will continue to witness in this paper. Galen had ambivalent feelings towards Crichton's cosmetics, which he expressed in a paragraph following the table of contents. So I'll read this passage. In these 4 books, Crichton wrote down most carefully almost all the most esteemed cosmetic remedies, adding to those embellishing remedies, komotika in Greek, which provide a fake beauty, not a real one. For that reason, I shall leave those remedies aside, and I will mention only those that preserve natural beauty. Indeed, if I know very well the unguents that make the body shine, those that preserve the breast of virgin girls, those that keep small the testicles of boys who have not reached puberty for as long as possible and prevent the growth of hair, I am ashamed to write about those. As several scholars have thoroughly discussed, Galen distinguished between, on the one hand, cosmetics, which dealt with natural beauty, and on the other hand, komotics, embellishing products, which went against nature and were therefore not part of true medicine. While late Byzantine authors were aware of the distinction, I mean, late Byzantine, late by my standards, I know they're not very late in the Byzantine period. So while Byzantine authors were aware of that distinction, it did not appear to concern them as much as it did Galen, as they did include remedies for the purposes which Galen found shameful. In the end of my paper, I will examine remedies for 2 parts of the body, the breasts, with some consideration for the belly, and the sexual organs. As time is limited, I will focus on remedies that were targeted towards women rather than men. So the breast. Cosmetics remedies for the breasts, by which I mean female breasts, are found in the writing of Oribasius, Paul of Aegina, the second book of Pseudo-Galen's Euparista, and the Metrodora treatise. Those remedies are normally included in sections on the breast which focus in a more holistic manner on their health and good functioning, so on lactation. In this context, it's useful to examine the section on preservatives for the breast in Paul of Aegina. There is a similar chapter in Oribasius, but it's actually much longer, which makes it less good for examination in a short paper. The section you have on your slide lists 3 preservative recipes, and it is part of a larger chapter on the care of the breast, which deals with inflammation of the breast linked to lactation. So that's book 3, 52.1, and with malign breast ulcers. So that's book 3, chapter 52.2. The 2 first recipes on your slide do not mention who is supposed to use them and in what context. The third one, on the other hand, does specify that the stone of Naxos should be used on virgin girls. This is an anti-puberty remedy, so it's something to delay puberty. As noted by Alessia Guardasole, similar comments on the stone of Naxos had been made by Galen and indeed also by Dioscorides. And Galen had noticed that the stone of Naxos could also be used on the testicles to keep them small. So for those of you who don't know, the powder from the Naxos stone is our emery powder, so the one that we put on sandpaper, which is well known for its abrasive properties. Such a remedy strikes the modern reader as particularly harsh and painful. We have no information, no explicit information on who would have used such remedies, but one possibility is that they were used by pimps of children prostitutes who wanted to delay the onset of puberty, or by enslavers who wanted to sell slaves as children who had not yet reached puberty, so as part of deception. It's likely that the second recipe in Paul on your slide, the one with hemlock, was also intended as an anti-puberty remedy, although it's important to note that Paul doesn't say that. What makes me think that is that both Dioscorides and Pliny the Elder, who were writing in the 1st century CE, had stated that hemlock keeps girls' breasts small, in addition to keeping testicles small, relaxing the sexual organs, preventing nocturnal emissions, and drying up the milk. So if you are surprised by this vast array of efficacy, and if you wonder why the same drug can allegedly dry up both semen and milk, that's because both semen and milk were considered to be transformed blood, and it's therefore to be expected that a drug that dries up one of the bodily fluids will dry up the other. The same combination of cosmetic concerns and concerns for the good functioning of the breasts is found in Pseudo-Galen's second book of Euparista and Metrodora's gynecological book, both works which are almost impossible to date, but are probably late antique. The structure is very similar in both texts, which also have recipes in common, pointing to a common source or common sources. Here, alongside recipes to bring out the milk, to dry it out, and to treat inflammations and other pains in the breasts, we find recipes of a more cosmetic nature. Recipes to straighten drooping breasts, recipes to keep the breasts small and pert. Some of these recipes are clearly for mothers, as they deal with promoting or checking lactation. Other recipes are more ambivalent. So we have recipes to keep the breast small and to avoid droop, which can be potentially used by all women, whether they're younger or older, whether they've had children or not. But it should be noted, however, that drooping breasts are often seen in popular thinking as the result of childbearing and breastfeeding, and it's indeed still very much a concern today. That there were cosmetic concerns over the maternal body is further illustrated by the existence of ancient anti-stretch mark remedies. And I don't have them on a slide, but I can tell you that there are several stretch mark remedies preserved in the 16th book of H.'s medical collection, where they're attributed to Rufus and Aspasia. And Aspasia is an authority who's quite frequently mentioned in this gynecological book. Okay, so I've talked about the breasts, and now I turn to the sexual organs very briefly. So we've already encountered recipes for the genital organs several times in this paper. So I've talked about pubic depilatories and remedies to keep the testicles small. Another category of cosmetic remedies for the genital parts are virginity restorers for girls. Some of these recipes are quite specific about who should use them. Thus, the second book of Pseudo-Galen's Euparista has a recipe so that a girl who has been raped may appear virgin, and the Metrodora collection has a recipe so that a damaged girl may appear to be a virgin. These recipes included astringent ingredients and might therefore have tightened the vagina. And as scholars such as Julia Sissa and others have noted, ancient virginity was a virginity without hymen. Physically, it manifested itself through tightness rather than through a membrane. The remedies on this slide are for use on young girls or women who needed to appear to be virgins. They might have been used in the context of prostitution, but it's not impossible that parents of a girl who had been raped would have sought remedies like these. However, we have indications that legitimately married women might also have wished to use virginity restorers. I realize that this is very small here, and if you want the slides, of course, I'd be happy to share them. Thus, in a section of Paul of Aegine's work devoted to remedies that prevent the vagina from becoming overly wet during sexual intercourse, we find a recipe which explicitly mentions marriage, gametheisa, followed by one which promises that the woman will appear as a virgin in sexual intercourse. The expressed reason why an overly wet vagina was not to be desired was that it might prevent conception. So Paul again wrote, and I quote, "If she cannot conceive because of the humidity of the womb, it is indicated by too much wetness during sexual intercourse and the menses being thin and abundant. A wet uterus, which manifested itself through an overly wet vagina during intercourse, would not be the right environment for conception to take place." How wet exactly is too wet is difficult to say, and it should also be noted that there are recipes for women who are too dry as well. But it seems to me that there is something more at play here than the concern for conception in this focus on tight, dry vaginas. In some cultures, the practice of dry sexual intercourse is considered a rewarding experience for male partners. Perhaps this was also the case in the ancient Mediterranean, although more research on other types of sources would be needed here. So, some conclusions. Galen might have found cosmetic recipes for the breast and genitals shameful, but it was rather in the minority, as his successors regularly included such recipes in their writings, often without any negative judgment whatsoever. They might have excerpted these recipes from Crito's Cosmetics, which might still have been in circulation in later antiquity, and or from other sources. Some recipes do appear in several of the texts I've mentioned, and that really points to a common source or several common sources. And I have not gone into detail about the parallel recipes, but there are several cases. One of the themes that emerged from this brief overview was the desire to prevent puberty. We observed it in the use of depilatories, in remedies to keep the breasts and testicles small, and in remedies to keep the vagina tight. Remedies for deodorants, which I have not examined, also participate in the same culture, as they sometimes refer to a goatish smell, which was believed to develop with puberty. So adults smell like goats. It is possible that remedies to hide the effects of puberty were used in the context of prostitution or of the selling of enslaved people. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between prostitution and slavery, since many sex workers in antiquity were enslaved. Although we can also see how parents of, quotation mark, respectable girls might have sometimes liked to make their children look longer than they were. Another area of concern we observed was for the maternal and or aging body, and in particular the female body, which is stretched, leaking, and drooping. While the feminist in me recoils at the use of such remedies, I can also detect some concern for the well-being and health of women here, as cosmetics remedies are often interspersed with remedies for the good health of the breasts. Through a study of ancient intimate cosmetic recipes, we can also discern the ideal female body, and to an extent as well the ideal male body, but I've focused on the female in this paper. It is the body of a younger woman with small and pert breasts, without wrinkles, stretch marks, or unsightly spots, and depilated. this certainly tallies with ancient artistic depictions of the female body, and on your slide is the Aphrodite of Cnidus, which is supposed to have been modeled on the very famous Hetaira Phryne. But the cosmetic recipes also allow us to go further than the surface of the body, and they give us insights into the ideal vagina, which is tight and not too wet. There is much more to be studied in relation to intimate cosmetic recipes, and I hope that through this short paper I have shown to you that they deserve further examination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurence, for this marvelous presentation and for showing us intimate parts of women and young men, especially. And now we will have another presenter, and this is Sean Coughlin, and he will be talking about recreating Democritus's part tricks. Sean, what, the floor or the computer or the screens?
Thank you. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Let me turn on my presentation. And can you see this okay? Or have I lost you?
Clearly. At least I can see everything. So
okay.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, good. Now, sorry, this is it's just a bit out of body because I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. I have my paper and I have the presentation and everything on the screen at once. So I'm just trying to sort all this out. Can I just ask you a question? If I do this, do you see the whole presenter view?
At least I see it.
Do you just see the main slide, or do you see all of the notes and everything? You can even just write it in the chat.
Okay, I've got the main slide with bullet points.
What was that? Sorry? Okay. Sorry, just one more time. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about a collection of recipes that are found in a papyrus. I'm not going to get too much into the provenance of it because mostly this is a talk about some methodological issues that come up when dealing with recreating or replicating past recipes. And it has a little bit of fun in it too, so I hopefully can pique your interest in this kind of understudied set of texts that we have within the medical tradition more broadly. Now, when we try to actually perform recipes, when we want to recreate them or replicate them, one of the reasons we do this is to connect kind of directly with the past. If we perform the recipes, we can have before our eyes and under our noses what was actually there in the past. And so we can understand something of the culture in a direct way, the same way we can understand something by digging it up. And this is one of the reasons why people often call performing recipes kind of experimental archaeology. And for the products that are usually the result of recipes, you can see why this might be important, right? Like these aren't things that are going to have survived in the ground, or if they did, it's likely they would have gone off in some way. So they have recently discovered some cosmetic cases in Britain that still have the cream inside of there, but I would be reluctant to put it on my face, not just because of the ingredients that are in it, but because it's been oxidizing for so long. But the assumption generally is that if we carry out a recipe, then we'll be able to reproduce what they had. But of course, there's a problem that comes with this quite at the core methodologically, and that's that recipes are generally pretty hard to follow. And it's not just that recipes are hard to follow, but it's that we kind of have a tendency to overestimate our ability to carry them out. So in ordinary cases, this is pretty easy to detect. You know, we know what the result is supposed to be because I've seen other people do it. So, you know, all of us during this pandemic, or many of us anyway, have tried the sourdough recipes, and I can watch the guy on YouTube doing his sourdough recipe, and I see very clearly that what I end up with is absolutely nothing like what they ended up with. And so I know I didn't do it right. But in historical cases, you can see the problem. We don't have the item from the past. So this becomes a lot more difficult. So how do we detect our overestimates of ourselves when we don't know what the result is supposed to be? And if we don't really know if we follow the recipe correctly, we can kind of get into a circular type of reasoning. The whole reason for carrying out the recipe is that we don't know what the result is supposed to be. That's why we're engaging in this kind of experimental archaeology. Now, if I follow the recipe correctly, thinking is, then I know I'll get the correct result. But how do I know I get the correct result? Well, I have to say, well, if I get the correct result, then I followed the recipe correctly. And so now we're in a circle. Unless I can know I've carried out the recipe correctly, I can't know I've gotten the correct result. But unless I know I've gotten the correct result, I can't know that I've carried out the recipe correctly. And to get out of this circle, either we need to know on independent grounds that we've carried out the recipe properly, or we need to know what the correct result is. And we've already said that we really can't do the second. That's the whole point of doing these replications. So we need to focus on the first, what independent grounds there are for understanding the recipe correctly. Now, the way this is normally done is that we look at other texts. So we try to identify plans or methods by comparing one recipe to other recipes. We'll look at scholarly identifications that have been made over time by different scholars and try to pick the most plausible one. We'll look at archaeological and archaeobotanical evidence. But the clear problem here is that oftentimes the evidence will point us in different directions. So sometimes identifications are rather certain, but sometimes they aren't. And one example I had recently was when I was recreating a perfume called the Mendesian, and there's an ingredient in here called Balanos merepsicae, or literally the perfume nut. And you get, or the perfumer's nut, and you get differing identifications if you look at different authorities. Some people will identify it with a species of moringa tree that produces a kind of long-lasting scentless oil, and other people will identify it with a species of balanites, which is a tree with a slightly different range and with a very different characteristic. And so how do you know which one of these to choose? Now, what many people have suggested we do recently, like Matteo Martelli in Bologna and the Alchemist Project, when encountering these types of problems, is to actually use experiments and replications as a way of testing various interpretations. So instead of simply, let's say, instead of simply going on other assumptions and picking one of these interpretations, let's just try them all and see what results. And then when we look at the results, we can then make kind of some plausible inferences about which the more likely candidate might be. Still, there are biases, and our expectations can still show up and lead us astray. So I want to tell a little story about these biases and to show some kind of pitfalls in this approach. Okay. So can you guys all see the papyrus on the screen here? Just somebody just maybe type that there. Okay, great. So this text is called I'm calling it Democritus's party tricks, and we'll see why. But in this papyrus, this is a papyrus held in London. It's number 121, and this is column 5 of this papyrus. It may have been found in Thebes. It's not quite clear because there was so much disorder when people were buying these papyri in the shops back in the 19th century that they don't really know the provenance. And as I say, I'm not going to get too much into that, but what's really interesting about this is that we have a set of recipes in this papyrus ascribed to the philosopher Democritus, and they're simply called painia. And what I want to focus on in this talk is the results of an attempt that I did recently to replicate one of these recipes, namely the second one, which is here, which is how to make an egg like an apple. Okay. Now, just a little bit about this text and why it's interesting. And I think there are 3 things that are interesting about this text. One is the contents, another is the attribution, and finally the context. Now, the contents, I think, are just inherently interesting in a I didn't know they had frat boys in antiquity kind of way. Now, it's 12 recipes, and if you look at them, it's kind of like everything you might think a jerk would do at a big dinner party. You can see the first, I'll just read these out to you, actually, just what they say. So the first recipe is to make bronzeware look golden. So this is to make your stuff look like it's worth more than it is. Then we have to make an egg like an apple, which must obviously be a practical joke, followed by another one, which is to make it so that the cook can't light the fire. This fourth is to make it so that those who eat garlic don't smell. Perhaps this is actually not a practical joke, but something quite reasonable. To make an old woman stop blathering and drinking so much. We have to make the painted gladiators fight, which is not really clear what that's referring to. To make cold appetizers burn the person who is eating them. We have to make those who have a hard time mingling easier going. And here the prescription is to give them gum with wine and honey and rub it on their face. I'm not really sure how that's supposed to work with the introverts. To make those who eat drink, to make those who drink not drink a lot, not get drunk. Eat baked pork lung. And we have actually some similar recipes in other texts, just eating lungs of animals to stop yourself from getting drunk. To make those who have to walk home not get thirsty, to have lots of sex, and to become stiff whenever you want. So pretty much gives an idea of what this guy thought a dinner party might go like in the time. Now, about the attribution. Now this is attributed to Democritus, and it's not likely that it's Democritus, the philosopher. Now there's some implication or some suggestions that it might be Bolos, the Democritian, and Matteo Martelli has written about this, and so have Glenn Most and Andre Lax in their new edition of the Fragments of the Pre-Socratics. What's kind of interesting about the fact that it is attributed to Democritus is that Democritus has this long tradition with the alchemical tradition, a long association with the alchemical tradition. And here, in the first recipe, we have a recipe for making bronzeware look golden, which seems to be a kind of harbinger of kind of more serious alchemical work. There's also the question about what's being attributed to Democritus here. We have the title of Painia, but it's not really clear that it's a title. So is this something like Democritus's Painia, as in a title of a work and a genre, or is it a Painion simply a type of recipe? And these are just Painia from the writings of Democritus. It's not really clear. And finally, there's some questions about, or some interesting aspects about the context of this text. And sorry, at a local level, what's interesting is how it appears in this papyrus as a whole. The papyrus scroll itself starts off with a set of Homeric incantations and lists of the days of the week when they're to be performed. And then it's followed by medical cures and love spells. So you just, like, I don't really understand what a set of frat boy jokes is doing among these other texts. It just doesn't seem to be much order to it. And then there's the global context, which is these Painia themselves. And it's a really difficult genre to pin down. We have another example from the magical Greek papyri that were edited by Price and Dance earlier in the 20th century. And that's this one: to make men who have been drinking at a symposium appear to have donkey snouts to outsiders from afar. Now you can see there's something quite a bit different in this recipe from the ones that we saw before, I think, and that's that this recipe seems much harder to believe would actually work. And this comes into play quite a bit when trying to understand these recipes. So, what is a painion? Is it a kind of trick whose reality doesn't really play into it? Or is it something else? And 1995, James Davidson wrote a little note for a Classical Quarterly trying to push the view that actually the painia here and generally simply refers to, painion literally means like a child's toy. And so he thought it meant maybe something like child's play, and that is something that's really easy to do, that you don't need complicated recipes or something complicated in order to get it to work. And this example here, you just need some donkey's blood and a wick, and you're off to the races. And many of the recipes involve these kinds of simple everyday ingredients. But David Bain, in a 98 response to this note, points out that playful tricks is probably more likely to be how they understood it in antiquity, because we have in Pliny a note about them that refers to them as refers to one painion as a ludos, so that this is a kind of game or something like this. Now, it's still not clear whether it's a genre of writing, and it could be that they came from a work of a different kind. And some really good work recently by Raquel Martin Hernandez in Madrid has shown parallels to some recipes interspersed throughout a text called the Treatises, which is a Byzantine text. It's really quite still not really well characterized. So here are two of these recipes that are similar, one from a chapter about donkeys. And here we're told that if you take hair from a donkey's butt and burn it and crush it up and serve it in a woman's drink, she won't be able to stop farting. And in another recipe from the section of the text on the hyena, we're told that if you mix a little bit of water from a sea wave, a wave from a sea, with a compound made up of hyena bile and fish eyes ground up, and then you sprinkle that on everybody at a drinking party, everyone's gonna freak out thinking that the sea is flooding into the middle of the party. So there'll be a mass hallucination. Now, these kinds of texts, if these are painia, raises kinds of interesting questions, most importantly about whether these were actually supposed to work, because these examples from the Ceraneides strike me as things that are much less likely to be tricks played on a victim, but more on the person who's actually trying to perform the trick. I don't think that these things will work. And if we look at Democritus's tricks, we can see, some of them seem quite plausible, right? Like to make bronzeware look golden, the first one. I mean, I've actually tried this. And if you mix unfired sulfur with chalky earth and wipe it on bronze, you'll get a very kind of dark patina. And maybe there's some way, if this is kind of in the candlelight, it will look golden. But some of them seem obviously not so easy to account this in terms of like them actually working. Like getting an introvert and rubbing like honey on their face is going to make them have a good time. Or this one, to get erections whenever you want by putting pepper and honey on a flaccid penis. It's not really clear whether these are that plausible. So I wanted to test as you see, well, how plausible are they? And so I thought I'd do the first one about the sulfur and bronzeware, but I didn't have any at the time. So instead I went with the second one, which is to make an egg like an apple. Now the recipe, seemed pretty straightforward. It's really clear what we're supposed to get. We're supposed to get an egg that looks like an apple. So that's clear enough. It's also clear what the ingredients are supposed to be. The ingredients are supposed to be saffron and wine and a boiled egg. And so it's pretty easy. I thought it was going to be very comprehensive. And so I was going to test all different kinds of things. This is how I think I should make tests. So I tested red wine and white wine, and I tested brown eggs and white eggs. Yeah, very, very comprehensive. So the method also seemed clear. We're supposed to simply boil the eggs, mix saffron and wine, and then anoint or rub or coat or smear, whatever the thing you do with chrismata is. You're supposed to do that to the egg. So that's what I set out to do. So first I took the wine and I mixed it with saffron, and then I let the mixture sit for a little bit in order to get the color from the saffron to get into the wine. And then I took my boiled eggs and I, was again very meticulous. I divided the eggs in half and I would paint half of an egg with the one saffron mixture and half of it with the other to see if there were any differences. And of course, what I ended up with is absolutely, it doesn't even look like a good Easter egg. Now, here I've made a major methodological mistake that I didn't realize, two actually. And the first was to do with the word melon, which I took to mean apple. But of course, melon in Greek doesn't mean apple, even though the translators all translate it as apple. It needn't mean this. It can also mean a quince, or it can mean an apricot, or it can mean a peach, or a plum. All of these are mela. And if you actually look at the paintings from the House of Julia Felix in Pompeii, you can see examples of peaches being served at dinner parties with wine. So there's no reason to suppose that we're only dealing with apples. Here's a close-up of that. And the second mistake was about the eggs. It's recently Easter time, so I've been thinking about this, because it's not just me who made this mistake, but Max Wellman, who looked at this as well, made the mistake of comparing this recipe to other recipes where you're dyeing Easter eggs that we find in the Byzantine tradition. But when I was doing this, my friend Lucia Raggetti, who's working at Bologna with the Alchemist Project, said, well, why don't you take that weird egg that you made and try slicing it and see if it looks like apple slices, like the skin of a quince or something like that. So that's what I did. And this looked pretty close, actually. This was starting to get better. If you took the egg yolk out, maybe you could see if, again, people are a bit drunk at a party, they might confuse this for an apple. It'd be quite funny. But I also noticed that as some of the saffron mixture had leaked onto the wine, that we got a nice kind of color. And so I decided just to mix it all together and just to mix it with the whites without a shell. And when I did that, I actually got this on the left, which looks really close to a peach slice. Actually, that's not a peach slice. That's one of my eggs that I dyed with saffron. Here's a real peach slice on the left, and this is the egg slices that I've dyed with saffron and wine on the right. Okay, so this looks pretty close, pretty plausible. Now, let me just go quickly through the next bit of this replication, because there's been another interpretation of another word in the recipe, and that is this word here, which is krokos, which has been interpreted by lots of people recently. Well, it was originally interpreted by Price and Bunce as saffron, probably correctly, in how I did it. But in Betts's edition or English translation of the recipes, it was translated as egg yolk, which is another word that saffron or krokos might be used. Egg yolk could be used as a translation for krokos. And Andre Lax and Glenn Bowes did the same thing in their new edition. They translated egg yolk. And so I figured the best way to approach this would be actually to do it again, do the experiment again, this time using egg yolk and saffron and wine mixtures, and see what happens. So I took saffron and I took some egg yolks and both eggs again and both kinds of wine again. And this is a little video of my attempt at this. So mixing together the various ingredients for the dyes to see what would happen. Smearing the egg yolk or the eggshells with the mixture first, because I was going to do it both to the eggshells and to the egg whites, just again to make sure I've covered all of the different variables. And these didn't end up looking like apples again. It was completely hopeless. So we just tried it with the egg whites. I also did it with the egg yolks for some reason. I thought, again, why not? But you can see that the egg yolk and wine mixture is absolutely disgusting. Like, it doesn't dye anything either. Okay. And so at the end of this, I did get, again, I would leave it up to you to decide which of these do you think is an apricot slice and which of these are slices of egg dyed with saffron and wine. So just a few conclusions about this. The first are some kind of textual conclusions about this little text from the papyrus. In most editions, it's printed this way, on moion melo genestai. And it's usually translated to make an egg resembling an apple. But I think it'd be, based on this anyway, much more realistic if we said to make an egg resembling fruit in general. And also, you can see that there's an emendation that was made. The manuscript says oon homoion melon, and this was edited by Prites and Duns to mean to melon. It was amended with a omega nu, like the genitive, and then it was again changed by Wesley to melo to give a dative to go with homoion. And Bain in his paper says that melo is probably the only possible solution because it needs to be singular, because we're trying to make an egg like an apple. But I think if we're trying to make an egg like apple generally, there's no reason why the text can't be melon, which I think is much closer paleographically to what was there. And finally, egg yolk is just got to go. It has to be saffron. But the last thing just to say is that these recipes aren't all the same, and some of them aren't, and not all of them are not meant to work. So I hope this recipe is carrying out this recipe has showed that some of them do work, and recreating recipes is, at least if we do it carefully, a good way to find out which of them do. And it means not just performing one interpretation, but lots of them. And while the results aren't definitive, they certainly can give us some insight into these texts if they're used properly. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
So, Sean, thank you for this enlightening, very educative, and very entertaining talk on egg yolk, quinces, saffron, egg whites, white wine, red wine, and other kinds of food and drink. And we'll be discussing this later still. And now we've got the last presenter in our session, and this is Chiara Thumiger, which will ask the question, Pόθεν phrenitis, the popular reception of the disease phrenitis in Christian sources. So Chiara, so the screen is yours. Observe the list of those that are present. Yes, Chiara is present. Am I right?
Yes. Chiara, could you please turn on your microphone and camera?
Yes, I thought I had.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Chiara has prepared a handout.
Yes, it's just a handout without only one page, so I can share it if you tell me how, or just, or you can do it for me.
It was uploaded. If you like, on top right screen, you have the event board. When you click it, there will be shared files, and you can download Chiara's handout.
Okay. Yes, so there is the, okay. So I hope you all have, yes, my handout, because I will refer to it, although it's not, yeah, I will be reading the relevant passages. Many thanks. So first of all, thank you for this invitation, and I'm afraid that after this two truly fantastic papers from Laurence and Sean, I'm going somehow to bring you back to a topic, entirely, if you wish, abstract and ideological in the way it talks about ancient medical views, but hopefully it will retain some connection with the clinical reality of patients' life, of real people's lives, so to say, at the time it was written. So today I would like to speak about one aspect of the transmission of the disease phrenitis in late antiquity. The transmission of this disease label is in fact a particularly interesting case study for the analysis of the survival, death, and transformation of medical concepts in general. So I hope to show it. It constitutes a kind of exemplary case, if you wish. So first of all, I should introduce very briefly this disease for those who might not have heard or know much about it. Phrenitis is first mentioned and described by the Hippocratic authors, medical authors from the 5th and 4th century BCE, and it is arguably the first explicitly mental disease of ancient medicine. It is not only among the earliest, but also the longest lived. In fact, it is lastly included by the French psychiatrist Pinel in his Nosologie philosophique, and still diagnosed in the 19th century of our era by actual doctor compiling clinical documents. It is an acute disease according to the ancient nosological categorization, which divided diseases into acute and chronic. And at the beginning of its attested history, it is grouped together with a number of other winter diseases like pleurisy, pneumonia, ardent fever, affecting the chest. It is characterized by high fever and it is often lethal. Later on, it is, however, identified with fever and mental disorder more generally, localized in the brain or meninges or nervous system, with our qualification for this anachronism, as localization of the mental faculties. On top of these various pathological details, the disease, like I said, had important characteristics we would nowadays describe as psychiatric. It is categorized, in fact, as quintessentially mental, maybe the most common and dangerous mental disease in the medical tradition, and one which somehow covers the whole spectrum of mental impairment and mental disability. So motoric problems, hallucinations, but also behavioral problems and problems about sensorial perceptions, and so on. Now, my topic today, this is part of a broader and longer project that I have about the history of this disease and history of ancient psychiatry. What I would like to concentrate on today is the popular reception of the representation of this disease. So the presence of phrenitis outside technical and medical texts, with all the necessary qualification, of course, about this distinction between popular and technical medicine. Now, how often is phrenitis mentioned outside scientific context? For example, mania and melancholy are already mentioned in the 5th century BCE, for example, in both comedy and tragedy. Now, the answer is, until the beginning of our era, we find very little, almost nothing, in terms of references to this disease outside medicine. Phrenitis is mentioned only once in Menander in the surviving literature until the beginning of our era, and even accounting for all the lost material that we might not have ever access to, it appears that to only have this one reference, and in a passage from Menander where really it is about mocking the jargon used by doctors, means that the disease phrenitis must have been, up to this time, a very technical and overridingly non-ethical presence in culture, meaning not conceived as a kind of metaphor for human states, but rather used as a technical nosological label. Now, after the beginning of our era, phrenitis begins to appear instead very frequently in allegorical, metaphorical usages outside medicine. Cicero, Seneca, Plutarch, in particular, in ways that are comparable, use it very often as part of a negative rhetoric in intellectual or sapiential discourses, or philosophical. If philosophers take phrenitis as a metaphor or a representation for mistaken judgment and intellectual inability, in popular culture, too, pathological features of this disease are variously exploited. We find references to behavioral aspects, for example, sleep troubles, spasmodic and compulsive movements, quarrelsome violence and drunkenness characterize phrenitis. Then there is hallucination, lack of judgment, and also lack of awareness of the disease, a kind of anesthesia, let's say, a kind of unawareness of one's movement and one's state, but also of the fact of being ill in the first place. Most poignantly, there are finally the moral flaws. These are the most interesting for me, and an important development in history of psychiatry, the idea that the mad is also bad. For example, the phrenitic is qualified by dangerousness and violence, by his suffering from pathological joy and misplaced emotions, a kind of euphoria which is terrible to look at from the outside, that is especially saddening for the family and friends of the ill person. By his complete unawareness of his disease, we have said, the phrenitic actually prides himself of his state. For instance, the fact that he's enjoying an immense and pathologically so physical strength and energy. Everyone from the outside can see that there is a kind of pathological tonus, tension in these patients, but they think that they're just very strong and vital. In theological disputes, phrenitis represents this all, the peak of flawed reasoning and misjudgment mixed with depravity and malignity. The phrenitic becomes, more generally in Christian texts, pastoral as much as hagiographic, the quintessence of that folly of mankind, the madness, in this case, of rejecting Christ through medicine in favor of money, lust, material pleasures, and so on. Often, the phrenitic are represented as an angry mob, a mad collective identity, incarnating humanity as a whole in their shared destiny and common sins. This non-technical, popular life of phrenitis is extremely rich in details and expressions and representations. For me, as historian of medicine, this body of sources is important because of the key role it plays in maintaining phrenitis alive as pathological concept for so many centuries in history of medicine as well as in larger culture. And for doing so via a hybrid discourse, which is, yes, allegorical, as we will see, but also exploits medical aspects of the label phrenitis in a way that is rather competent. The greatest elaboration of all these moral and intellectual aspects is found, of course, like I said, in Christian authors, both theological and hagiographic. I take here as a representative a passage from what is really a huge body of evidence, and I take this as representative because it really is one case of many. I picked one particularly explicit example, but this level of discourse, this terminology, and this exploitation of the concept is really present in a huge number of examples. And this is a passage from John Chrysostom in the commentary to the first epistola at Thessalonicenses, chapter 5. Now, John uses phrenitis metaphorically or allegorically in several of his homilies. I wish to concentrate on this one representative quote, in which he obviously has a kind of moral wholesomeness in mind when he places the disease, and phrenitis in particular, so the idea of disease and in particular the example of phrenitis, at the center of a list of intentional ills and pains for which man is responsible through his or her acrasia. The passage comes again from, like I said, from chapter 5 of this homily in Epistulam Primam ad Thessalonicenses. And I read here first from the translation, and then I will give some closer comments. If you want, you can follow on the handout as well. So if one should strike a dead man, he perceives it not, he revenges it not, but is like a dry piece of wood. So also his soul is truly dry, having lost his life. It may receive countless wounds every day and have no feeling of any, but lie insensible to everything. One would not err in comparing such men to those who are mad, or drunk, or delirious. All these things belong to vice, and it is worse than all these. A person who is mad is much allowed for by those who see him, for his disease is not from choice, but from nature alone. But how should he be pardoned who lives in vice? Whence then is vice? Whence are the majority bad? Tell me, whence have diseases their evil nature? Whence is phrenitis? Whence is deep sleep? Is it not from carelessness? If physical disorders have their origin in a deliberated choice, much more so those which are voluntary. Whence is drunkenness? Is it not from an intemperance of the soul? He then underlines and develops the medical points he has already touched on further, by connecting his physiological determinism, fever and a lack of balance, cause phrenitis, directly with a moralistic and responsibilistic frame, ethical flaws cause a physical and spiritual imbalance. And this is the last paragraph. Is not phrenitis from excess of fever? And is not fever from the elements too abundant in us? And is not the superabundance of elements from our carelessness? For when either from deficiency or excess we carry any of the things within us beyond the bounds of moderation, we kindle that fire. Now, there are various points to look at more closely here. Now, first of all, there is this allegory of death in the very first paragraph in the text on your handout. The sinners, the flawed individuals John is talking about, are dead people, like dry sticks, dry soul. They have lost their life. They have no feeling. Nekron, uchaistanetai, they are like a xulon awon, and their very psuche is awon. And then also there is this insistence on the fact that they have no feeling. Udenos aistanetai analgetos prospantia diaketai. So these characters are dry on the one hand. They're like inert matter, and also they have no sensation of what is outside them. So key in this first part is this topic of insensibility. To be dead is not to feel, to be unaware of one's wounds. These two aspects are not only important in a kind of moralistic, metaphorical discourse, but also they refer very precisely to aspects of the disease phrenitis that are discussed by doctors. In fact, the idea that the phrenetic doesn't perceive correctly, hence the hallucinations, hence the fact that they are unaware of their disease, or simply they don't realize who is with them and what is happening to them, or the people around them, are described very well in the tradition, from the Hippocratic patients, but also to discussions in Galen and in other medical authors. So the idea that this lack of perception, this non-astanestai, this inability to perceive, should be presented here in a kind of spiritual metaphorical representation, shows very well how these authors are not simply referring to a disease in a kind of superficial allegorical discourse, but referring in a very precise way to medical aspects. Then in the second paragraph on your handout, we see that after the reference to the necroi, the dead patients, the dead as metaphorical target, you have a pathological category being isolated: the mad, the drunk, and the stricken. It would not be a mistake to compare this kind of people to the memneosis, so those who are suffering from mania, those who are drunk, those who are tois parapaiosis, so those who are stricken in some way. On the one hand, there is a pathological category that is used to qualify them, and on the other, there is a reference to something that is not really part of the discussions about mental health in ancient medicine, which is this idea of kakia, mynomenos on the one hand, but also the idea of wickedness or depravity, kakia. And here, on this occasion, it is introduced an important discussions that, again, it doesn't belong until a later time to the ancient discussions of mental health, which is the idea of diminished responsibility, or to what extent can a person be excused for his or her behavior for the fact of being mad. In fact, this topic of sugnome is key in this discussion, and is particularly important to distinguish between the people who can be pardoned and who can be excused and understood for behaving in a certain way, and the degree of responsibility that make the illness become a form of vice. Also in this paragraph, very important is the distinction, and in the end, the rejection of any serious difference between those diseases that come from proairesis and those that come to us through nature, physis. If, as he writes, you can excuse someone whose disease comes not from choice but from nature alone, but something that comes from a choice of living in vice, how can that be pardoned? And this is the point in which, in some way, a disease like phrenitis, which is categorized in a very deterministic sense as based on the constitution of one's body, is finally ascribed to a flow of the soul, to a vice, an expression of kakia. And then, from the third paragraph on, come the research question par excellence, which is here rhetorically repeated many times. Whence, where from, Pόθεν, come, phrenitis, and all these flows that he's talking about. Now, this interrogation can take various meanings. You have causation, but also origin, and a kind of existential or metaphysical doubt about the why certain things come about. Now, the repeated questions cover the whole territory, from medical, peripathetic, problemata-like inquiry, diati, to spiritual questioning. And in fact, there is an extension between the literal or smaller question, whence is vice, whence can phrenitis, whence is deep sleep, and again here we have a reference to a whole medical tradition, because phrenitis very often is coupled with sleep disturbance and also with a disease that have to do with sleeping patterns, lethargia. So whence is phrenitis, whence is deep sleep? This might sound like a medical question, but whence is vice? Whence are the majority bad, with an extension? So the pathological question is not really concerning one disease in particular or only one disease, but also, in fact, the majority of mankind. Whence are the majority bad, hoi pleius kakoi? Whence have disease in general their evil nature, and then phrenitis and deep sleep? And then a kind of suggestive question, which is an answer. Is it not from carelessness? Is it not from aprosexia? And before he had mentioned also akrasia. So there is this idea, of course, that there is a degree of responsibility in the lack of discipline and dissolute kind of, lifestyle that one has. Physical disorders can also be something, that come from choice, then all the more in the case of those which are voluntary, like drunkenness and intemperance of the soul. So in these last two paragraphs in the text come the explicit reference to the medical discourse, with a combination of physical and mental, or spiritual features altogether different from the materialistic view of a body-soul continuum, which is familiar to any of us who have worked about mental health and physiology in general in ancient Greek medicine. The kind of continuum I'm talking about here, it's rather a complete moralization of physiology and pathology, which uses, in this case, phrenitis as pivot and key example. So building blocks of medicine, the reference to fever, the reference to imbalance, ametria, pleonexia and endeia, for example, excess and lack, pleonazonton and emin stoikeia, so this stoikeia, the idea of an imbalance or excess in the measure between certain elements. This hyperbole pure tu, this excess in fever. These are technical terms and technical concepts, but they are used here, like I said, as bricks, as building blocks, in order to build a moralized anthropology, a representation of man as project and purpose. And in particular, you have the reference to in the fourth and in the fifth paragraph to phrenitis, to hypnosparus or lethargia, one could suggest, to the physicanosemata, the hyperbole pureton, the stoikeia pleonazanta, and so on. Finally, there is the topic of aprosexia, just like the akrasia that he had mentioned a bit earlier. All these are forms of proairesis, of voluntary choice, that cause these diseases. So carelessness, lack of discipline, are responsible for kakia and illness. These excesses mimic those stigmatized by dietetic discourses, the excess in drinking or in sleeping or in exercising or the lack thereof. These excesses and these suggestions mimic, like I said, dietetics, but point, of course, to more. There is a kindling of the fire through bad habits, of a pure, which is here a great example of interaction in imagery. There is the real physiological puretos of the phrenitic, the fever, all doctors talk about, but also the metaphorical fire, the pure, of moral perdition and of the deserved punishment that is attached to the destiny of humanity as a whole, or of this community of drunken and mad and phrenitic sinners. On the whole, and I draw some conclusions here, this passage expresses a complete rewriting of the body from the medical model along normative and moral terms, where body and soul truly form a continuum. Phrenitis is not the only typical illness evoked. There is mania in general, for example, and melancholy in some cases, but mania and phrenitis are perhaps the most common examples. But unlike mania, which is somehow a more diffuse pathological concept, phrenitis, on top of being one of the most referred to in these discourses, is also isolated as technical item, and it's really rich in pathological and medical details and make it quite precisely identifiable. It is a central example and the richest one, in my view. This allegorical phrenitis is emblematic as a key step in history of psychiatric ideas, along the lines I have sketched, but it is also important in another sense, which interests me here: the use of technical, scientific knowledge in a non-technical context as a way of transmitting information through independent, unofficial channels, so to say, outside professional quarters, doctors and physicians, among the culture classes, but not only these, the layman, the larger public, which are audience and recipient of this homily, for example. In this way, one representative Christian text from the 4th century shows us a use of a medical concept as vehicle of moral edification, while at the same time transmitting, perpetuating, and disseminating medical knowledge about a pathological state. Many thanks.
Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. Very, very, very interesting. On the verge of morality and medicine. And now I think we've got 13 minutes left. And now we can allow some time for questions and comments. I think that we still have like half an hour just to safely switch to another session. So I just wanted to welcome comments and questions. Who is supposed to, or who feels willing to ask a question to one of our presenters? We've got Chiara, we've got Laurence and Sean, and I can't see any people.
Maybe.
Yes, Sean is willing to ask a question. Sean.
I think Chiara beat me, but I'll go after Chiara.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Yes, I had a question. Well, I have for both, but I start with one question for Laurence, and I was interested in the passages, in particular in these recipes about conveying an impression of virginity or prepuberty in patients, and if I remember correctly, this idea of dokein or paraphinestai, I think, were the verbs a virgin, and you mentioned Sissa's discussions about what it is to be a virgin as something not related to the hymen but other aspects of the body. So I was wondering, what from these sources and others, what kind of construction of virginity would you? I mean, it's a difficult thing to sum up, but how would you describe virginity in the way? You mentioned tightness and dryness, but is there something, a kind of broader picture you have come up with?
Laurence, could you switch on your phone, your mic?
Yes, sorry, I was double muted as usual. Not really, and I haven't read Sissa for a while, but it does seem focused on really having the tight, dense body. So it's at the level of the vagina, but it's also more general for the body, that it's tighter, and then as the body matures, it becomes looser and less densely structured. There's other sources for this that are very interesting. So, for instance, you know that there's the which I'm interested in. So there's the pseudo-evangelium of James, with the story of how Mary gave birth to Jesus, and there's this midwife called Salome who tests the virginity of Mary, and she says, it's so wonderful because I've witnessed the birth of. Well, no, she hasn't witnessed the birth, but she says that the parts of Mary are too tight for having given birth, basically. So it's a lot about being very tight. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So another person asking questions, either to Laurence or to Sean or to Chiara.
Laurence, I have a question. I have a question for you, and then I have a question for Chiara. But I was wondering, so you mentioned that some of the purposes of the recipes and the treatments would have been for possibly slaves for sex work, and that this was conveying an ideal of female beauty as well. And I was wondering about the boys' side. Because these, the ideas of preserving, I guess, prepubescent boys suggest that this isn't like an ideal of a high status, of men of status, or a landowner, or wealthy person, or anything like that, or wealthy man. But this is something about purchasing, or about keeping something in a certain way for use, rather than, say, a man's ideal of his own beauty. I guess that's the question. So, is this something that somebody would want to do to themselves, like a man would want to do to himself in order to keep his testicles from wrinkling? Or is this something that he would be wanting to do to something that he owned, or to something that he might purchase someone?
I think it depends slightly on the purpose. So for the anti-puberty, I do think there's quite a lot that points towards selling. So whether that's in the context of prostitution or other contexts, there's evidence that's earlier that points me in that direction. So there's in Pliny there are some recipes where they talk about depilatories for young boys that are going to be sold as slave. So there are some recipes that are a little bit more specific about the purpose. So that, I think it does point towards that. But the thing is, once you have something out there, there's nothing to prevent other people from using it. I don't, and I don't know. I've not spoken about this to people who might be, non-binary or trans, and what they would think about that, and people using those recipes in those contexts. So some people might have wanted to do this, but that, the evidence is, as you know, the evidence of recipes is very difficult to evaluate in that respect. They're very short. Yeah,
that's interesting. Thanks. And then Chiara, I was just curious, like this moral aspect of this comes up a lot in Stoic sources. So there are a lot of first century Stoic sources that are saying things like all of the new diseases that we have are because of our moral failings and the fact that we eat too much and eat everything. And if we were just like our farmer ancestors, we would be really healthy. And I was wondering to what extent this is being picked up by Chrysostom, because I know a lot of the Christians seem to pick up other arguments from the Stoics, particularly about the changing Stoic position on sex. Like early Zeno is pretty much everybody should be having sex with everybody, and then by the time of the later Stoics, it becomes very they become very austere. And I was wondering if this argument might have antecedents in these kinds of things, because it's a popular conception, right? He doesn't seem to know much about medicine, saying that it's a kind of plethora of elements in the body.
Yes. I mean, I think surely it's picking up not only on medicine, but also, especially this idea of a folly of humanity, of a kind of madness that, that concerns the whole of humanity. Stoic, and it is not only, something that that comes from a Christian view of mental health or spiritual soundness as a whole. But it's not about the idea of new diseases. Particularly, I don't think this is central here, in the sense that I haven't noticed in this particular Christian elaboration of the idea of phrenitis an idea that these diseases are specifically new. And the discussion about the fact whether new diseases can exist at all was actually an important topic. And you have a discussion in Plutarch, for example, in which he explicitly, argues for the fact that there are no new diseases, that humanity, the pathology and the physiology of the human body is always more or less the same, because the body cannot change that much. So the kind of the manifestations, the nosological manifestations, are a bit like a boat bobbing around an anchor. So there are changes in the epiphenomenology, perhaps, of disease, but not so much in the actual, underlying nature. So in this sense, what I notice here as maybe coming from other levels of discourses is not the idea of novelty, but yes, the idea that there is a way in which pathology can, somehow paradoxically and non-medically characterize the whole of humanity. So how the categories and the amount of people who might be involved is not really, what medicine would see, a matter of categories that need attention, but something that is extending to the whole of humanity. So there are many levels that come together here, but the medical one is, of course, a pretext. But I don't see it as completely incompetent, because once you know the discussions, the medical portrayal of phrenitis in detail, you see that many of the detail are mentioned here. Maybe not in a competent way, not in a deep way, but the reference is quite punctual. That's why it's really a kind of hybrid. That's the impression that it gives me, at least.
Just to follow up, I guess what I think was really interesting, that stuck out to me, is that we don't have anything about upbringing, which is kind of like when Aristotle talks about the morality of disease, or when Plato talks about the morality of related to disease, we get a lot of discussion about what your parents did and how they brought you up and how society brought you up is why you're out of control sick, and either mentally or physically. And that's beyond your control. It's not your fault. And here we have this author saying, like, you should have known better. And this seems to me like outside of the academic tradition and more aligned with the Stoic, but it's really interesting to see that he doesn't even bring this up.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it's never, that part is like speaking to a kind of synchronic human being that doesn't have, in that sense, a particularly a past or a development. Yes, this is true. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. Any other questions?
I guess I had a question for Sean. Very fun, those experiments. I was thinking about the connotations of eggs and apples, and both are associated with aphrodisiacs. And so when you were talking about those being, jokes or frat things, so do you think they're playing on that as well, on sexual connotations of the ingredients?
I mean, there's so many of the recipes in the Cyrenides that do just this, right? They have a lot of sympathetic magic. Even the recipe from the other magical Greek papyri about farting and taking like hairs from a donkey's bum. Like, this is like clearly sympathetic magic. And I had not thought about mela and eggs and all of the other recipes there for like whatever's like cures of impotency and sexual gratification. So it could be. I guess I don't know enough about this, of the different kind of symbology, to be able to say. I mean, it's definitely something that would be worth looking into. I just hadn't thought about it. I'd have to think. It's really cool.
You know that farting is associated with aphrodisiacs as well, because windy plants are considered aphrodisiacs. So
yeah, because it pumps you up, right? Like, this is
That's right. Well, no, it's to do about new bad things.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Like, literally, like a bicycle pump. Like.
Okay, who next? So may I? May I pose a question to Sean first? You mentioned that saffron, which was mentioned in the recipe, could be understood as egg yolk. On what basis?
There are some, so the kind of, what seems to have happened, I mean, LSJ documents it in the different sources, but we have some sources where saffron krokos clearly means egg yolk. And what happens is that the color of saffron, so the saffron krokos comes to mean the color, which then comes to mean the color of the egg yolk. So they refer to the part of the egg that is krokon, and then it just becomes that on its own. So that's kind of the chain of inferences that gets there.
Is it fully convincing to you?
I mean, I have seen, like, I mean, if you look at the sources, it couldn't mean anything else when it does show up as in the sense of a krokos comes up as a sense of egg yolk, but usually it's adjectival there, and it's actually modifying part of an egg, and it's not used on its own, but it's to distinguish it from the white, right? So it's just as convincing as that. I mean, other people will use xanthos to describe that part of the egg as well. So krokos at some point comes to mean a color, and then it's used to distinguish it from the white of the egg.
Because it can't have been knekos, because this is basically something different, yeah? Although the
same time, which?
Knekos, as far as I remember, so this is urzęd barwierski in Polish, I don't remember. This is actually something they offer us instead of saffron. Wherever you go, for instance, to the covered market in Istanbul, yeah, and they claim that it is saffron, while it isn't. Yeah, it's something like a sort of plant dye you use for dyeing anything. Yeah, this is this yellowish substance, which is quite. I don't remember. Maybe I will look up.
But not like an oak gall or a galapful. Is that knikos?
Okay, I will try to find it in a second, which is Kokosz Barwierski, and
sorry, Laurence, you're
find the name.
In English, it's a safflower. Knikos.
Oh, safflower. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. So this is, but one more suggestion. As far as I remember, for instance, in something like the recombinaria, if you use egg yolks, usually you get them cooked. So could you simply, one suggestion, try them cooked? Maybe the color.
Cooked egg yolk. That's absolutely.
So this would be my suggestion for you.
Thank you. That's a good one.
And now for Laurence, if I may. You mentioned Crito, which is a very prominent figure as far as cosmetics are concerned. And to what extent you also mentioned, yeah, because you gave this fragment from Galen, yeah, about cosmetic care and commodity care, yeah. And I've got a question. Is he supposed to be the only responsible for those, say, cosmetic-like things that are popping up everywhere, like in Aetius, or earlier in Oribasius or Paul of Egina? What about, for instance, what about Archigenes of Apaneia? And he was also interested in very similar things. Do you think that it is possible just to clearly separate all those layers of Crito and others? And do you have any idea where, when, and where probably it started? Because Crito must have used someone, yeah? Do we know something specific about his sources? I mean, specific, not saying that it might have been, but saying that it surely was.
Yes. Galen does say that Crito has used previous sources, and I think Cleopatra is certainly mentioned there, and then there's others that are mentioned.
But you don't know which Cleopatra he meant, yeah?
Well, it means something called attributed to Cleopatra. You know, whether I'm not going to pronounce myself on the authorship of Cleopatra, and now we do know that in the Byzantine medical treatises, there are passages, for instance, of Cleopatra that are preserved that are not in Galen. Yeah. So whether the Byzantine authors have access to Cleopatra via Crito or other prominent cosmetic works, or directly going back to Cleopatra, that's difficult to say. I would be very reluctant to say that everything that is in the Byzantine authors is from Crito. I think there were several volumes that were circulating on cosmetics.
Okay. On the other hand, did they have their copies of Crito, or is it something like transmission from Galen to Oribasius, and from Oribasius to Aetius, and so on and so on?
So sometimes they get the recipes mediated through Galen. Yeah. Sometimes not. Mm-hmm. So it can be quite complicated there. It's also possible, although I don't have evidence for that there were, compendia or abbreviated versions of Crito or other things. So it's very complex. As it's always the case for recipes.
Because I've come across of Aetius of Amida, soaps, deodorants and other things, and he mentions like Crito, and also Archimedes, very close to each other, and you in fact cannot know from what sort of direct source he borrowed this. Yeah, basically it looks like he had at his disposal one source and the other, and in his way, which was very typical of him, just mixed or put one close to the other. So yes, I would agree that this is a very, very complex question, but extremely interesting. From my point of view, simply for a historian who would like to know what sort of deodorants were available, and you can find really much information, what sort of powders and for what purposes were used, or what sort of dyes, hair dyes, although they also belong to cosmetic care, they are quoted all over Galen and other physicians. Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation, and of course Sean as well, and Chiara as well. We've got also Irene Kala, who might contribute to what we are discussing, especially about the transmission of recipes for cosmetics, and hopefully we will soon see the results of her research published. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Could I? Yes. Please, yes. My name is Olga Karagiorgou. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much to all three speakers for a very, very enjoyable paper. My question is directed to Laurence, and it comes from someone who is completely ignorant in this field. But since you were discussing ways to shrink the testicles, and if I understood well, it was associated with wishing to make a boy look younger than his age for purposes of selling him. Okay, I mean, this whole discussion brought to my mind the castrati, where you actually, remove testicles in order to maintain the beautiful voice of a male singer. And I was wondering, when from is there evidence of this practice, and whether, you know, what you described as directions on how to keep the testicles small have anything to do maybe with such a procedure? I don't know.
Thank you. That's a very good question, very useful, actually. There is a quite graphic description of how to make a eunuch in Paula Vagina. I don't know if you know it. So
yes, probably yes.
Yeah, with the descriptions, I don't think that those remedies that I mentioned are the same, and I don't think they could achieve the same effect, because really to produce a castrati, especially if you're looking at, you know, someone who's going to not develop a beard and keep the high-pitched voice, you really need an intervention that will be
take away the testosterone completely.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
More. I think it's more. So I think sometimes, you know, they say so that the testicles won't be wrinkly. That might be something to do with age as well. So that's a bit different. But when they say to keep them small, I really think it's about buying time and delaying puberty.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
I'm sorry for butting it, but I just remember, for instance, Dioscurides writing about chickpeas, as far as I remember, which were pulverized and then were used just exactly for testicles. And as far as I remember, Dioscurides writes about testicle inflammation of some sort. And of course, it's unclear, and you've got a very similar thing in Galen. And you've got this like growth of the testicles. So it's not connected with the wrinkling, but if you've got an inflammation, it's associated with edema, with a sort of swelling, and swelling makes it bigger. So it's simply about the size of the testicles and not about the question, say, what's the surface of that private part of the patient?
Well, there's a lot of ambivalence, and it's quite similar to the case of the breast, where you will find recipes that are really about real inflammation or proper ulcers, and then suddenly something that is more cosmetic, and the boundary is very blurred. You know, when you cross into the cosmetic. In a way, it's easier to see what's going on with women, because there's more writing directed towards women as women than towards men as men. But yes, sometimes when they say keeping the testicles small, it might be because there's an inflammation, a disease. But sometimes depending on the context, you can really tell that it's for cosmetic purposes and for delaying puberty. I mean, that's what Galen says. It's cosmetic, comotic.
Commodities. And as I can see, we've got Professor Giuseppe Squillace with us.
Good afternoon to all, and many thanks for the interesting talks. And I have a question for Sean about the word melon, because melon is a general term, as you said, and perhaps it means also a very kind of, for example, citron or orange or bergamot or lime. Melon is anything round, and of course is an apple, but not only apple. Can be a kind of orange or of citron. I live in the south of Italy, and I know personally this, and I think it would perfect in a recipe, in a perfumed recipe with 2 perfumed ingredients like wine and saffron. And the last thing, the form of the egg is like a citron. Is the same. Is not identical, but it is almost the same. Is more similar than an apple. I'm sorry for my English, but
no, I understand.
You have understood.
No, I've understood. Your English was perfect. It was. I'm just thinking. First, it's great to meet you finally, because your work on perfumery has been quite important to me. And I think on this question about melon, I think we agree that it has a very broad semantic range. And the Persicon melon, which, when you hear it in Theophrastus, it means something like a citron. And by the time we get to the period of the early empire and in Pliny, it starts to mean peach. And so we even have shifting of these kind of regional variety names that get passed around. Now, whether an egg can look like a citron, I mean, this is one of those things where I think the performance of it might actually help give some proof. So, go to a party with these eggs dyed with the saffron and wine and see if they get confused for a citron or for a peach. I mean, this would be one way to test this kind of hypothesis, which I think might be fun. It would have to be a kind of a dark room, but it might work. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's one of the ways to try to test that. And I think, at least in terms of the translations, they should keep as broad a range of fruits open as possible in this case, to allow for these different interpretations rather than settling on one.
Okay, many thanks.
A question or suggestion. May I? Professor Squillace asked about citron. I would exclude it, because citron is much larger than an egg. And then the rind is yellow. But when you cut it into pieces, you will see that the inner part is white. And this makes a difference. For instance, when you think about quinces, what's the use of changing an egg into a quince? Because you don't eat generally quinces raw. In order to eat a citron or eat a quince, you should prepare it. So pre-boil it and usually add something like honey. And for instance, obtain something like table sweets. What do you have? A sort of marmalade? Yeah. And in this way, it was used to be prepared. I would think more of apricots or peaches, because they are similar size, and when you cut them, you can see that the inner part is the same color. And what Sean demonstrated to us was that once it is dyed with saffron, so the inner part of the egg, turns, so the white turns yellow. So if there is some use or logic, especially culinary logic, I would exclude citron and I would exclude quince, and I will choose either apricots or peaches. So this is simply a suggestion.
3 different recipes.
I think at the next colloquium, we can, maybe if we do it in person, maybe then we can just have a table serving at different events to see which one works the best. Yes. Maybe that would.
I mean, let's do it. We've been working on something.
3 different recipes.
What's the way of preparing a hair? So hair, basically, that really poses a number of questions. So this is very, very intricate, very complex.
Yes.
tricky, in fact. Okay. Are there any questions or comments? I can't see any. So if not, I will thank you very much for your fascinating presentation and for very interesting discussion. And now we'll have less than a quarter of an hour just to switch to another panel, which will be led by Laurence. So Laurence will moderate the next panel, Food and Medicine in Byzantium.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Professor Sculata, are you with us still?